the stage is silent. A single violin note hangs in the air like mist over a northern lake. It quivers, fragile, suspended, as if unsure whether to continue or fade into the quiet. Then the orchestra rises. First the woodwinds, then the strings, then the brass, calling like distant horns across a deep forest. The sound grows larger, heavier, deeper, until it feels as though the music itself is breathing, slow and ancient, like the land beneath snow. This is not just music. It is a memory, a landscape, a nation learning to speak in its own voice. John Sibelius. To many, he is Finland's greatest composer. To others, he is the man who gave Finland its sound. But to truly understand him, we must understand something deeper. Sibelius did not simply write music, he helped shape a national identity, and he did it at a time when Finland was not yet free. Because when Jean Sibelius was born in 1865, Finland was not the Finland we know today. It was a land caught between power and pressure, a grand duchy under Russian rule, still marked by centuries of Swedish cultural legacy. Finns spoke many dialects, lived separate lives, and held different loyalties. There was no unified idea of Finnishness. There was no shared story, but stories can be made. And sometimes they are made through sound. This is the story of how music, myth, and national longing intertwined, and how one man's compositions helped ignite a cultural awakening that changed the fate of a country. But to understand how Sibelius found that voice, we have to go back to a quiet childhood town, a broken violin string, and a young boy who believed sound could speak where words could not. John Sibelius was born Johann Julius Christian Sibelius in Hämeenlinna, a town surrounded by lakes, forests, and quiet roads where winter seemed to stretch forever. His family, educated and Swedish-speaking, lived in the world of European culture, not the rural folk culture of Finnish peasants, but something happened early in his childhood that would shape him. The Finnish language movement was beginning. Teachers, writers, and thinkers, inspired by the Kalevala, the ancient Finnish epic, began encouraging a new idea, that Finnish culture was not lesser, not provincial, not something to be hidden. It was something to stand on, to be proud of. Sibelius absorbed this shift like air. He heard his first violin as a child, and the sound stayed with him. His family could not always afford lessons, but he practiced anyway, sometimes in secret, sometimes for hours, lost in tone, chasing something he could not yet name. There is a story often told of him as a boy. He would walk alone through forests, listening, truly listening, to the sound of wind moving through pine needles, of ice shifting on lakes, of the distant call of birds. These sounds would later echo in his compositions, not imitated, but remembered, as if the music already existed and Sibelius was rediscovering it. But his early life was not untouched by pain. His father died when Jem was only 2. His mother struggled to manage the household. There was uncertainty, fragility, and a search for stability. Perhaps this is why his music is never simply beautiful. It is longing. It is distance. It is silence and sound together. But Sibelius's life was not destined to remain quiet, because soon he would meet a world and a country on the edge of transformation. The late 19th century was a time when Finland was still learning how to imagine itself. Politically, the country was under Russian rule, a grand duchy, semi-autonomous but watched, pressured, and shaped by the empire's policies. Culturally, Finland had been influenced for centuries by Swedish language and administration. The people lived with multiple identities, layered and overlapping. Finnish-speaking rural life, Swedish-speaking educated classes, Russian imperial authority. There was no single Finnish nation, just fragments. But in these fragments, something new was beginning to form. a literary revolution, a rediscovery of myths, folk songs, and oral traditions that had survived in villages and forests for centuries. And the book that tied them together, the Kalevala, compiled by Elias Lönnrot from the Songs of Common People. The Kalevala was more than literature. It was a mirror, reflecting a cultural identity many didn't realize they shared. And young John Sibelius walked straight into this awakening. As a young man, Sibelius first pursued law at the University of Helsinki, a practical path, one his family could approve of. But his heart was not in textbooks or courtrooms. He spent more time in cafes than in lecture halls, more time listening to music than reading legal statutes. Eventually, he made a decision that felt more like instinct than choice. He abandoned law. He would become a composer. Helsinki at the time was becoming a centre for the Fennoman movement, a push to raise the status of Finnish language and culture, and Sibelius was swept into it. He began studying at the Helsinki Music Institute, later named after him, the Sibelius Academy. There, he met artists, poets, and intellectuals who were driven by something larger than personal ambition. They believed that Finland could be more than a province, more than a divided land, more than a footnote in the shadow of empire. They believed Finland could become a nation, and art, not politics, would lead the way. In 1890, Sibelius encountered the Kalevala not as a book, but as a living story. He heard the melodies of runo singers, the rhythmic, chanting tradition that carried Finland's myths across centuries. Something inside him recognized this music, not because he had heard it before, but because it sounded like where he came from, the forests, the lakes, the silence. He began to compose differently. Where his earlier works echoed European romanticism, his new compositions drew from Finnish oral tradition, repeating phrases, ancient interval patterns, rhythms that felt like oars moving through water. The shift was not just musical, it was ideological. Sibelius was beginning to compose Finland. In 1892, Sibelius premiered Kullervo, a symphonic work based on one of the Kalevala's most tragic heroes. The performance stunned the audience. This was not polite salon music. This was something raw, ancient, unpolished, and unmistakably Finnish. The reaction was immediate. Fennomans declared Sibelius a champion of Finnish cultural identity. Audiences felt they were hearing something that belonged to them, something that had always existed, but had never been expressed with such power. Sibelius was no longer simply a composer. He had become a symbol. To modern ears, music may seem separate from politics. But in Sibelius's time, culture was a battlefield. The Russian Empire had begun policies of Russification, aiming to erase national differences. Russian language was pushed into administration. Schools were restructured. Newspapers were censored. Expressions of national identity were viewed with suspicion. To say Finland is a nation was not just pride, it was resistance. And Sibelius's music became one of the most powerful non-violent weapons of that cultural struggle. Because music can cross borders that laws cannot block. It can express what cannot legally be spoken. It can awaken something in a people before they even realize what has changed. Sibelius's melodies were not marches calling for revolution. They were landscapes, emotional maps of belonging. They made listeners feel Finland not as an idea, but as something lived and shared. This was identity taking form. This was a nation imagining itself. But the moment that transformed Sibelius from composer to national icon had not yet arrived. It would come during a time of censorship, anxiety, and public tension, when music would become a message spoken without words. By the late 1890s, the atmosphere in Finland had changed. What had once been a slow cultural awakening had turned into something more tense, more fragile, more dangerous. The Russian Empire, concerned about growing national consciousness among minority regions, intensified its policies of Russification. Administrative control tightened, local authority weakened. Language, culture, and press freedoms grew restricted. Finns began to feel their autonomy slipping. Newspapers were censored. Student gatherings were monitored. Public criticism of the empire could lead to arrest. But ideas do not disappear because a government orders them to. They go underground. They change form. They find new voices. And sometimes they become music. In 1899, Finnish journalists organized what they called the press celebrations. Officially, the event was simply a fundraiser to support newspapers affected by censorship laws. But everyone understood the true purpose. It was a protest, disguised as a cultural program. Public speeches were dangerous. Written protest could be seized. But music could move through a room like breath. Sibelius was invited to compose a new work for the event. What he created was not a political song. It did not name the empire, nor call for revolt. Instead, he wrote something deeper, something ancient, something that awakened memory rather than argument. A tone poem that brought images to mind. A land shrouded in mist, a people quiet, patient, enduring, and then slowly, a rising, a lifting, a voice emerging into light. This composition would later receive the name Finlandia. When the first notes were played, the audience did not simply hear music. They felt something. The piece begins in shadow, dark, heavy brass, like a force pressing down. The strings enter quietly, like something struggling to move beneath weight. The tension builds slowly, a nation not yet speaking, but listening. And then, the turning. The music opens into a hymn-like theme that rises calmly, steadily, confidently, not triumphant, not aggressive. Something else, a declaration of existence, not a shout, a breathing in. The melody was instantly recognized as something sacred, not in religion, but in identity. It sounded like home. And in a room full of people who felt their cultural voice slipping away, the message was unmistakable. Finland is still here. Finland is still alive. The audience rose to their feet. Some wept, not for sorrow, but for recognition. For the first time, many felt what it meant to belong to something greater than themselves. This was not art separate from politics. This was art becoming nationhood. The Russian authorities recognized the political power of Finlandia immediately. Performances were restricted. Programs could not list the piece by its true name. So conductors began renaming it. Impromptu, Symphonic Poem, Opera 26, a Scandinavian tone poem. Some programs simply used a blank line where the title should be. But the audience always knew. The music needed no title. In fact, the censorship only strengthened its impact. Every performance became an act of quiet resistance. A room would fall silent. The opening dark brass would begin, and everyone understood. This was more than sound. This was statement. After Finlandia, Sibelius was no longer simply a composer admired for talent. He became a figure of national identity, not by activism, not by speeches, but through something more enduring. He gave Finland its sound, a sound rooted in landscape, memory, silence, and endurance. A sound that expressed the unspoken, that a nation can exist inside the hearts of its people long before it exists on paper. This is why, even today, Finlandia is more than a composition. It is played at graduations, funerals, sporting events, national ceremonies. It has become a ritual, a reaffirmation of identity. Because identity is not only learned, it is felt, was also shaping Sibelius himself in ways that would soon bring conflict, pressure, and personal struggle. Recognition brought fame. Fame brought expectations, Expectations brought weight. And as the 20th century began, Sibelius found himself in the middle of a new challenge. How do you carry a nation's voice without being crushed by it? His rise had made him a symbol of hope. But symbols are heavy things to carry. And soon, Sibelius would face pressure from international critics, financial instability, and the dark, quiet battles of his own mind. Sibelius' rise to national prominence brought admiration, respect, and celebration, but it also brought something far heavier: expectation. The more Finland embraced him as the voice of the nation, the more Sibelius felt the weight of that responsibility pressing against him. He was no longer merely composing music. He was, in the eyes of many, composing Finland itself. And that kind of expectation does not simply inspire, it can suffocate. Through the 1890s and early 1900s, Sibelius wrote some of his most defining works. Karelia Suite, 1893. The Swan of Tuonela, 1895. Finlandia, 1899. Symphony No. 1, 1999. Symphony No. 2, 1902. Each composition deepened his reputation. Each performance seemed to strengthen the shared emotional language of the Finnish people. But behind this success, life was not steady. Sibelius struggled with money from the beginning. He lived above his means, not out of pride, but because art required time, space, and quiet. He entertained guests, hosted salons, travelled for performances, and tried to maintain the role expected of him within cultural circles. And so the debts grew. He was not a wealthy man creating freely from a place of comfort. He was a man constantly balancing inspiration against obligation. The pressure mounted. And when pressure met uncertainty, Sibelius turned to something that brought immediate relief: alcohol. Sibelius did not hide his drinking. He drank in celebration, in stress, in social gatherings, in loneliness. He drank because the world was loud and he needed silence. He drank because music demanded total presence, and sometimes presence was overwhelming. His friends joked that Sibelius lived in two worlds: the sober Sibelius, dignified, thoughtful, disciplined, quietly intense; the drinking Sibelius, loud, grand, charming, reckless, alive. This contrast became part of his legend. It also became part of his decline. At times he would promise his wife, Aino, and himself to stop, to return to calm, to restore his health, to focus entirely on composition. But silence is difficult for a man whose mind is full of sound. The bottle always waited. If Sibelius was the storm, Aino was the shoreline. She held the family together. She protected the children from the volatility of mood and melancholy. She learned to speak not only to her husband, but also to the shadow that occasionally took his place. She believed in him even when he doubted himself without her. Some historians say there may have been no fifth, sixth, or seventh symphony. Music history often speaks of geniuses as solitary figures. But Sibelius was not alone. His legacy is also hers. One of Sibelius's greatest inner conflicts was his place in the international music scene. European critics praised him, and then, at times, dismissed him. Some considered his music primitive, too tied to folklore, too distant from continental modernism. Others called him a visionary, a composer of landscapes, a master of emotional geography. In Paris and Vienna, he was respected. In Germany, admired. In Britain, celebrated. But as expectations grew, Sibelius began to feel something tightening inside him. The more the world demanded new music, the harder it became to create. Composition, for Sibelius, was not a matter of technique or repetition. It was excavation, digging into something ancient and personal. And that process takes silence, stillness, distance. But fame rarely grants silence. In 1904, Sibelius and Aino moved to a house in the countryside, northwest of Helsinki. The house was named Ainola, after Aino, an acknowledgement of what she had given him. It stood among birch and pine, overlooking fields and water. Here, the air was clear. The world was slower. The silence was real. Sibelius believed, hoped, that in this quiet, he could escape the chaos of expectation. And for a time, it worked. From Ainola, he composed some of his greatest works. Symphony No. 3, 1907. Symphony No. 4, 1911. Symphony No. 5, 1915. Revised 1919. Symphony No. 6, 1923. Symphony No. 7, 1924. These symphonies do not sound like national anthems or heroic declarations. They sound like inner landscapes. They move slowly, like clouds shifting over a lake. They swell and retreat like the breath of a sleeping forest. Where earlier works spoke for the nation, these later works spoke from somewhere more private, more fragile, more human. This was Sibelius turning inward, not declining, distilling, looking for something deeper than nationalism, the sound of existence itself. Because in the silence of Ainola, something else also lived, something that had always followed Sibelius, quietly, a sense of incompletion, a question that would haunt him for decades. Was the music he created enough? The world had celebrated him and the nation had embraced him, but John Sibelius was not done yet. Ahead lay a masterpiece born from flight, movement, and transformation, and a long, mysterious silence that still puzzles historians today. The First World War reshaped Europe. Borders shifted, empires trembled, and the old world cracked open. For Sibelius, the war years were not only defined by global events, but by something more intimate. A sense that time was moving, changing, and slipping away. He was no longer a young composer rising. He was a national figure, deeply admired, deeply scrutinized. And in 1915, on his 50th birthday, the Finnish government did something unprecedented. They awarded him a state pension for life, recognizing him as a national treasure. It was an honor of the highest kind, but it also meant something else. Finland was telling Sibelius, "We need you. We expect you to continue. Your voice is our voice." The pressure returned, quiet, soft, but constant. During these years, Sibelius spent long hours walking the forests around Ainola. He walked in silence, listening, not to birds, not to footsteps, but to what waited beneath sound. He kept a journal where he recorded impressions, shapes, ideas. Today, I saw 16 swans. One of the greatest experiences of my life. God, what beauty! They circled over me for a long time. Their call was like the sound of a brass instrument. This moment became the seed of his fifth symphony. It was not written from theory, not from political pressure, not from the expectations of critics or the burden of national identity. It came from the landscape itself, the breathtaking, simple grandeur of swans in flight, a movement of life, grace, and inevitability. The symphony grew slowly, revised multiple times, evolving into something both monumental and intimate. It did not shout. It ascended. When the Fifth Symphony finally premiered in its revised form in 1919, listeners experienced something that felt unlike anything Sibelius had written before. It begins gently, hesitant, searching. Themes appear, break apart, return transformed. The structure feels organic, like watching ice melt, reform, and shift with light. And then the swan theme. It rises from deep strings and horns, broad, slow, dignified, not soaring like a bird in speed, but gliding like one in certainty. The theme does not force itself. It moves like something ancient awakening, majestic, yes, but also quiet. This is not a triumphant hero. This is a being of nature, older than nations, older than conflict, older than human emotion. The music suggests something Sibelius had always known, but only now could articulate. The self is small, the world is vast, and beauty can exist without explanation. The final movement ends not with flourish, but with 6 massive chords, separated by silence, chords like steps, chords like breath, chords like something ending or beginning. Every performance of the Fifth Symphony ends the same way. The audience sits, waiting, suspended in the moment of the final silence. And nobody wants to be the first to breathe. After the Fifth Symphony, Sibelius continued to compose Symphony No. 6, restrained, pure, austere, like melting snow. Symphony No. 7, a single movement ascent, almost beyond form. But these works were not national statements. They were personal reflections, inward journeys towards something essential. Sibelius was moving away from being the composer of Finland. He was becoming the composer of silence, perspective, and interior world. A poet of stillness. And this evolution left him in a strange position. The world was moving toward modernism, sharp angles, dissonance, artistic rebellion. But Sibelius was moving in the opposite direction, towards simplicity, clarity, elemental sound. Critics argued about him fiercely. Some claimed he was a relic. Others believed he was ahead of his time, too subtle for the era. But Sibelius no longer cared for the argument. He was searching for something that could not be debated. Something he had been listening for since childhood. The point where sound and silence meet. Throughout the 1930s, Sibelius worked on what he intended to be his 8th symphony. He revised, rewrote, destroyed, restarted. Years passed, then decades. The symphony became myth, spoken of, rumored, anticipated, but it never appeared. Late in life, Sibelius burned sketches in the fireplace at Ainola. Whether these included the 8th symphony, historians still debate. What matters is this: Sibelius chose silence. Not because he had nothing more to say, but because he believed some things must remain unwritten. Some music exists only in the mind of the composer. Some art is not meant to be shared, only lived, but silence is not absence. And though Sibelius withdrew from public creation, his influence continued to grow, shaping not just Finnish identity, but the global understanding of music, landscape, and memory. The 1920s passed into the 1930s, and then the 1940s. Europe was changing once again, borders shifting, cities burning, ideologies colliding. But at Ainola, on the quiet hill surrounded by birch and pine, life moved slowly. Sibelius and Aino lived in a rhythm that seemed almost outside of time. He would rise in the morning, walk in the forest, listen to birdsong and wind, eat simple meals, sit near the fireplace, and return again and again to his desk, where paper waited, perfectly blank. The world thought he had stopped composing. But silence does not mean stillness. Inside Sibelius, music was still moving. Not loud, not urgent, but present, like a low hum beneath consciousness. He was not a man who had abandoned music. He was a man who had followed it to its quietest place. Ainola was not grand. It was not adorned with trophies or decorated with reminders of fame. It was warm, wooden, modest, chosen not for status, but for shelter. Aino kept the home with steady patience. She worked the garden, tended the land, boiled water from the well, and saw to the household needs. Visitors would sometimes describe the atmosphere at Ainola as almost spiritual, not in ceremony, but in stillness. There was a rule in the household. Noise must be minimal. If Sibelius was thinking, no one disturbed him. If he was writing, the house became silent as snowfall. He once said, "The music I have not written is the best," not meaning that what he composed was inadequate, but that music exists before it reaches paper, and that only fragments can ever be captured. The rest remains inside. The world outside Ainola was shifting dramatically. New musical movements, atonal, experimental, modernist, began reshaping the classical landscape. Composers like Schönberg, Stravinsky, and Bartók challenged the very concept of harmony and structure. Some critics claimed Sibelius had become outdated, a relic of romantic nationalism. Others admired his restraint, his clarity, his refusal to abandon emotional coherence. Debate about him intensified. Entire schools of musical philosophy used him as their dividing line. To some, Sibelius represented continuity, music that remained tied to nature, memory, and human feeling. To others, he represented resistance to modernity, a refusal to abandon meaning in pursuit of abstraction. But at Ainola, the arguments did not matter. Sibelius no longer wrote for critics, audiences, or nations. If he composed for the silence itself. By the 1930s, word had spread that Sibelius was working on a new symphony, his eighth. Conductors requested it. Publishers waited. Orchestras around the world were prepared to premiere it, and Sibelius truly worked on it for years. But the music did not reach the state he wanted. Not because it was unfinished, but because it was unresolved. Sibelius had spent a lifetime refining his voice. Now he had reached a point where the music was too pure to speak aloud. There is a story, not proven, but deeply believed, that late one night, Sibelius fed page after page of the Eighth Symphony manuscript into the fireplace at Ainola Aino. In a letter, recalled the day like a quiet funeral. He burned so much. I cannot tell you how it hurt me. When the fire had died, there was nothing left. If this is true, then the final work of Sibelius's life was not composition, but the decision not to release what he could not perfect. It was not destruction, it was acceptance. Some art belongs only to the one who created it. From the early 1930s until his death in 1957, Sibelius released no new compositions. 25 years, a silence longer than many composers' entire creative lives. Yet this silence was not empty. It was walking through fields in every season, listening to the ice crack on spring lakes, watching the swans return each year, drinking coffee in the morning sun, reading the paper by lamplight, talking quietly with Aino in the evenings, waiting for something unnameable to arrive, realizing that it already had. For Sibelius, the silence had become the music, a final movement stretched across decades. His last great work, in a way, was peace. When asked near the end of his life what sustained him, Sibelius simply said, Aino. Their marriage had carried storms, illness, fear, joy, admiration, resentment, forgiveness, and enduring devotion. Aino once wrote, his music was his language. I only needed to be here and listen. In old age, they sat often together on the porch at Ainola, watching the birch leaves tremble in the wind. Few words were exchanged. They did not need them. Sibelius died at Ainola on September 20th, 1957, at the age of 91. He was buried in the garden. Beneath the silence, he had spent a lifetime listening to Aino continue to live in Ainola for another 12 years, until her death in 1969. She was buried beside him. Even in death, they remained a single story. But Sibelius did not disappear with his passing. His influence grew, not only in Finland, but across the world. And in ways few could have predicted, the silence he left behind has continued to speak. Jean Sibelius left the world quietly. No farewell symphony, no final public statement, no grand closing gesture. Just the silence of Ainola, the birch trees moving in the wind, the lake reflecting the sky, and a life that had already shaped a nation. Yet after his death, his influence did not fade. It deepened. Around the world, orchestras continued to perform his symphonies, not as historical pieces, but as living works, music that seemed to change depending on the listener, the season, or the state of the world. And in Finland, his presence was felt everywhere in schools, in concerts, in national ceremonies, in the quiet pride of a country that had once struggled to define itself. Sibelius had not merely written music, he had written identity. Sibelius is often described as the composer of forests, lakes, snow, silence, but this is not a poetic exaggeration. His music sounds like the Finnish landscape, not literally, but emotionally. The long, slow transformations of his symphonies echo the gradual shifting of light across water. The heavy chorales resemble the weight of winter skies. The distant horns call like migrating swans over autumn fields. His music teaches the listener to wait to hear the space around the notes, to feel the presence of what is not said. This is a very Finnish form of expression. Emotion held quietly, pride without boasting, strength without display. Sibelius did not compose Finland by accident. He composed it because it was already in him. Outside Finland, Sibelius influenced composers, poets, and filmmakers. His music entered cinema, memorials, national events, and personal moments of reflection. Conductors admired him not for complexity, but for clarity, the ability to say something enormous with very little. When Leonard Bernstein conducted Sibelius, he called him a poet of nature, a master of proportion, a voice unlike any other. Today, in concert halls around the world, something remarkable still happens. When Finlandia begins, even those who do not know its history feel something rise within them. Not nationalism, but recognition. The recognition of longing, of endurance, of the quiet strength inside all people. Sibelius's music is not local. It is human. Sibelius did not chase trends. He did not attempt to shock or provoke. He did not write to impress critics or compete with other composers. He followed something deeper, the truth of sound. This made him seem old-fashioned to some, revolutionary to others, and impossible to categorize. But this is precisely why his music continues to breathe, because trends fade, movements collapse, ideologies shift. But the sound of a winter landscape, the feeling of watching silent water, the quiet grief and quiet hope inside the human heart, these do not disappear. Sibelius wrote music that lasts because he wrote music that listens. In the final decades of his life, Sibelius wrote nothing he chose to publish. But this silence was not failure, it was completion. He had already said what he needed to say, and he understood something most artists never learn. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the decision not to speak. Just as winter holds the seeds of spring, silence holds the echo of sound. In Finland, in the long quiet forests, in the still lakes, in the spaces between words, silence is not emptiness, it is presence. Sibelius understood that he did not end his life composing. He ended it listening. There is a place near Ainola where the trees open and the sky widens. In the late spring, the swans return there. They glide across the lake as they have for thousands of years, white, unhurried, certain. Their wings beat the air with a slow, dignified rhythm. This is the sound that once struck Sibelius so deeply that it became the heart of a symphony. Even now, if you stand there at sunrise, you can hear the echo of that moment. A sound like breath, like distance, like memory. It is quiet, but it is there. Sibelius may no longer walk those forests. Aino may no longer wait by the window for him to return from a morning walk. The house may stand still in its silence, but the music remains. Not only in concert halls, not only on recordings, not only in the pages of scores, but in the way Finland feels itself, in the calm strength of its people, in the respect for quiet, in the endurance of winter, in the return of light. Sibelius did not just compose a soundtrack for a nation. He helped Finland hear itself, and when the swans pass overhead, gliding toward an unseen horizon, it is said that some listeners still hear, if only for a moment, the echo of a single clear, resonant chord, the sound of a nation remembering itself,